Welcome to Startup Health TV. I'm your host, Logan Plaster. So for a long time, the price that you're going to pay for a drug at the pharmacy has been in a black box. The insurer, the manufacturer, the pharmacy itself, they all have their fingers in this price, making it almost unknowable to the patient, as well as to the provider. This is all changing thanks to a wave of entrepreneurs who are taking on this problem. Notably, GoodRx recently IPO'd. It's a company that helps consumers compare prices on drugs, and it's now valued at more than $20 billion. So while GoodRx tackles the patient side, the company RxRevu has been working for 7 years to bring drug price transparency to physicians at the point of care. Today's episode is an interview with Carm Huntress, the CEO of RxRevu. We're going to look back over the last 10 years or more and see how pharmacy tech has changed, see the logistical hurdles that have kept drug price transparency at bay, really talk about how COVID has changed the dynamic, and then look forward at drug price transparency, how it's going to improve clinical care, and the critical role that this plays in both the access to care and the cost to zero moonshots. I hope you enjoy. Carm Huntress, thank you for joining me today for this episode. Really excited to have you and to learn more about what RxRevu is doing right now. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Real pleasure to be on, and long time startup health company. So we've been around.
Yeah, I want to get into that history a little bit because in kind of watching some of your material, your presentations, they go back to 2013, 2014. And so I thought as a way of framing the challenge that you're trying to address, kind of what was broken that caused the need for RxRevu, maybe you could tell us about how prescription transparency and the issues you're dealing with have changed over the last 6-7 years since you started.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that are different and a lot of things that are the same.
I was wondering, yes.
So I think I'd start off by saying, how we started, and it's interesting. I just had my company meeting, and we have this thing we call the Lucy Up Award.
Say it again?
The Lucy Up Award.
Okay.
And we give it out every month, and our founder, Dr. Kevin O'Brien, was the one who came to me and said, hey, I think there's, I want to start a company around this idea of cost transparency and helping patients save money. Well, he started because his mother's name is Lucy. Okay. And he as a doctor kind of looked at her expensive medications and very quickly recognized, I can save you about $400 here by just changing some of your meds. And he said, geez, I bet there's a lot of other people in this same boat.
Yeah.
And so we've coined this phrase, Lucy up, help Lucy, save money on her medication, get transparency. We're all patients. We're all trying to help our mothers, our parents, our friends, especially in this environment. And so we have this Lucy Up Award that kind of goes back to that founding story of why we're here. I think what's so interesting, right, is when we started let's say 2013, if you look at the market then, GoodRx was just kind of coming to fruition. Like it had a little bit of visibility in the market. It was still a relatively small company. The tech and so not a lot of movement, right, in pharmacy IT. And we'll compare that to the Delta in a minute. And then really the technology, right, in terms of or EHR maturity to take on cost transparency, the concept of cost transparency, like, can I know how much my drug's going to cost when I reach the pharmacy? That idea was both from a technology and sort of a conceptual idea was still really immature. Fast forward to today, okay, wow, this is one of the hottest sectors out there, right? If you look at what's happened, you've got startups, incumbents, especially on the fulfillment side. So Hims, Roman, Nurex, TruePill, Amazon PillPack, Capsule, right?
Yeah.
It's crazy busy, and there's a lot of money flooding in to tackle it. Yeah. You've also seen this massive consolidation, right? You've got Aetna, CVS, you've got Cigna and Express Scripts, and you've got United and Optum. All, and those are two new mergers. United and Optum are existing, but those are the big players, and they own, 80-90% of the market.
Okay.
And so a real big change there. And then on the pharmacy IT side, we have a standard now, which is called real-time benefit check, which allows us, which is the core thing our business done, which is transact with the payers and PBMs like the Express Scripts or Optum to get the real-time cost for the patient of what they're going to pay for the drug. At the moment, the prescriber's writing or entering the prescription into the electronic health record. And so we've seen great maturity of the electronic health record and taking on this data at scale, and that's driven a lot of our scale, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And number two, we've seen the payer PBMs mature around being able to run these types of transactions and then make them available at very large scales for both providers and patients.
Interesting. I want to get more into kind of what that market activity has meant for you and kind of what 2020's looked like. But for anyone watching this that needs kind of a flyover of what you've built there at RxRevu, sort of give me the elevator pitch.
Yeah, sure. So we consider us kind of the leading independent cost transparency vendor in the market today, focused primarily on prescription drugs. We're starting to do transparency in other spaces, which we can talk about. But our core business is really in drug cost transparency. Mm-hmm. And so related to doing this at the point of care. And we had to make some hard decisions on the way getting here to this point as a company to focus primarily on helping providers around this. And the reason for that is, we kind of said, well, who really controls the prescription decision? Mm-hmm. And it really is your doctor. And we really look at the transparency movement as if we're going to make a delta change in the overall prescription drug market and bring down costs, we've got to get transparency to providers. So our network is approaching 150,000 doctors, probably going to go to 200,000 in the next 6 months. And we were at like a few thousand at the beginning of last year. A delta change.
Wow. Okay.
And we probably did about 1 million transactions last year, maybe. We'll do probably close to 30 million this year.
What's been the driver? How would you describe the drivers of that change?
Well, it's two really big things. One, the EHRs have really started to adopt this standard, but they need companies like us that connect to all the payers and PBMs and aggregate the data together and then provide it. So any doctor seeing any patient on any health plan can get the data they need, right? To know what the price is that patient's going to pay at the point of care. So we bring that transparency to the EHRs, and we're doing that with Epic and Cerner at scale now. And I'm happy to announce that we just signed Athena Health. So we have now the 3 largest ambulatory EHRs in the US working with us and bringing this data to the point of care. So
is that a tech challenge? Is that an interoperability challenge? Like, what is it that makes it so difficult to get, or is it just a bureaucratic challenge?
Well, it's bureaucratic in that there's a lot of other other things like COVID and regulation that the EHRs especially are trying to meet. It's two-sided challenge, right? We've had to work a lot with our EHR partners to get them to adopt these standards and make it available so the provider can see what the cost is. Are there any restrictions? What are the therapeutic alternatives to the drug that might save the patient money, and do that all in real time? And then maturing the payers and PBMs to be able to run these transactions at scale in real time and normalize all that data across these very arcane systems. These systems, we're tapping into claim systems, which are very antiquated. Some are mainframe-based systems. Some you have to look at multiple systems to pull together a complete transaction. So you'll have sort of a claim system that'll give you the pricing, but then you have like a coverage system that'll tell you if a PA or quantity limit is on the drug. You have to kind of do a lot of navigating of really complex systems. We do have a really phenomenal engineering team that figures out all this stuff and is constantly maturing. Our success rates were 93%, which is probably the highest success rate in the industry now in terms of and both performance were sub 2 second, sub 1 second in some cases in terms of getting these transactions to the point of care.
Okay, when you say successful at getting the transaction to the point of care, what does that mean?
That it didn't air out. The doctor said, hey, I want to prescribe Humira. Let's just take an example. We get that request out of the EHR. We normalize that for a payer or PBM. We say, oh, this is a United member. Okay, let's go over to Optum. We then clean up that transaction and make sure it's well formed, and and then we request all the data, and then it comes back, and then we know we can send it back to the EHR, and the doctor's going to see what they want to see, which is the price of the drug and this other information. So we really have to ensure that runs really well, and that you get that success rate. And these are very meaty transactions. You're passing around, drug data and dosaging and quantities, and because you're literally saying, what is that patient going to pay at their preferred pharmacy that day, at their CVS or Walgreens or whatever it may be. So it's a really hard thing to do well at scale, where we're running millions of these transactions on a monthly basis.
Interesting. Something that we've written about, or at least in my work I've written about for years, is the issue of perverse incentives. And in healthcare, people their incentives aren't aligned and working against one another. And obviously there are pieces of the healthcare system that would benefit from people paying more for their drugs, and you're coming in and helping them. So where does RxRevu fit into aligning people's incentives?
Well, I think you gotta, when I think about this market, the first and most important thing to move into value, which is really what we want, because what we're saying today is we're not getting the value for the money we're paying. and for prescription drugs, we have to rationalize that. You're not going to rationalize that unless you have transparency, right? You can't say, is this cost reasonable or not, unless you know the cost.
Yeah.
And so we think we're on the tip of a very big spear that's going to start to sort of have this value-based discussion. And it's exciting because, we're starting to talk to some of our partners around, not only talking about patient costs, but what is the plan going to pay? And what's that total cost of care for the drug? Which, when you think that about from a provider perspective and taking on risk, that's a pretty important number to know, and to know it in real time when you're prescribing the drug is definitely going to help lean into value. And that's really the first step. Beyond that, you start to say, well, how well did the drug work, and look at clinical data and clinical outcomes, and then sort of say, well, for what I paid and the clinical outcome I got, does it all make sense? And so we think we're just really on this sort of the first phase that really needs to happen and get the market going into value, is make everything transparent and well understood of what people are going to pay. And then we can really start to think about value.
What's really worth doing? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It's interesting to think that this piece that is so complicated and you've worked so hard on is still just the tip of the iceberg, tip of the spear, whatever your metaphor is.
Yeah. A lot of people say, I still get this question. And I got it even early back in 2013. It's like, this hasn't been done. Like how are doctors prescribing drugs today if they don't know the cost, right? Not only back then and still goes on today, a lot of that data that they were getting was actually inaccurate. It was static data that was kind of getting passed around. It wasn't real time.
Yeah.
And so, it was the worst of the worst, which is not even is this, they are getting data, but it's actually the wrong data.
Yeah.
And so, we've had to do a lot to course correct. And I think a lot of people are trying to do a lot of sexy things in healthcare right now. And I don't really look at it that way. I think we need really simplistic solutions to a lot of these challenges, and transparency is just one of those. I don't face this as much because we've had success as a company. We've gotten to a lot of scale, and our revenues are growing really fast now. But early on, I had a lot of investors say, "Where's your AI pitch?" And I just say, that's not what doctors need. AI is 6 iterations of this thing, right? It's a much further thing out there, because guess what? The AI can intelligently tell you what the best cost basis drug would be for a patient without knowing the cost. So let's solve that problem first.
Yeah, you get one response from the investor who says, "Where's the AI pitch?" And then every single one of the 1.5 million doctors says, "Please, I need this yesterday."
Yeah,
anyone.
The cost of the drug.
Yeah, it's like, I just want to know what I'm sending you home with. Every doctor I know wants to help their patient get the best drug for the best price. It's just
it's that simple. Easy, right?
Which leads me to a question. I saw you in a presentation you made online. I saw you connect the dots between being able to present the best drug at the best price with physician burnout, you know, and it's easy just to have the story stop with the patient. Like, I'm glad they saved some money, but to go upstream and to connect those dots and say, this really impacts provider or physician well-being. I'd love for you to sort of expound on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the odd thing about healthcare IT, right? Every other time we've introduced technology to an industry, we've seen a massive gains in improved outcomes, better, cost for value makes sense, right? In every industry, healthcare has not achieved that. The inverse has happened. We've introduced technology and things have gotten much more complex. And these systems were really built, in a much, sort of earlier iteration of IT, and weren't really built with they were built, at least on the provider side, with a focus on revenue cycle management. They weren't focused on user experience. And so you hear these kind of crazy statistics, like an ER shift, a normal ER doc clicks like 4,000 times in a shift. It's like an insane sort of thought of like, just to get through an 8-hour, they're facing that much clicking around the EHR, and that's not even keyboard time. That's just mouse clicks.
My father is an ER physician, and I've shadowed him on shifts just to sort of see what that's like. And besides the clicking around, just the sort of sitting at a desk charting for
forever, right?
A long time.
And so, the first that, and that is such a massive contribution to what's happening to doctors, right? Is this just massive documentation, that the overhead, they have to work at night and get everything documented correctly. The EHRs are kind of stopping them and hard stop alerting them all day. I mean, if you used a computer like an EHR where, every minute or so you get an alert in your face, you'd burn out, and that's massive contribution. And so talk about a lot, and I love this phrase, which I got from one of my board members, which is informed autonomy. Is what we want is these systems that are kind of monitoring behind the scenes and assessing the information and bubbling up to the doctor. Here's your best options, whether that be in diagnosis support, where it's sort of saying, hey, I'm sort of supporting you and kind of sorting out the differential and what the diagnosis is here. And then here's the treatment options that are best for you. And what we've done in prescribing is we've expected way too much out of the doctor. I always bring up this example. If you have a type 2 hypertensive, let's say diabetic in front of you, there's something, our data scientists did this calculation, there's 1.3 trillion drug options, 1.3 trillion drug options in front of that doctor in that moment, right? And they're trying to pick 3 meds for that type of patient, which is very common patient. That's not something out of the norm. And so, if you think about the clinical complexity we force providers into, the amount of knowledge they have to retain and understand, let's just take the cost issues out of it, just from a clinical perspective. And then this sort of very hard choice of, what's the insurance and what you're going to pay. It's not really a human computational thing, right? Humans should just not do that. Yeah. And that's really my belief, in that we're kind of building, componentizing, and putting all the pieces together to create a system that drives informed autonomy and helps that doctor get to a small set of options. And they can assess, hey, is this going to be too expensive? Are there clinical concerns here? How am I being that empathetic partner to the patient, understanding the social things that technology is kind of not so great at, to guide to the right prescription decision? And that really is the future I believe in. And I think that's where technology should help. And if we do it right, the burnout issues will go away. I mean, how cool would it be to a doctor if you have sort of these AI engines around you supporting in the diagnosis and treatment, and they're more complementary to you and get you back to why you became a doctor in the first place, which is to be the empathetic, sit by, hold the patient's hand and talk about their condition and how we treat them and make them healthier. Like that's a great future. And I really hope we can be part of that at RxRevu.
Is the clinical decision support portion of this, is that part of the current product, or is that your future vision?
It's interesting. We had early technology that we developed in some specific clinical areas around that. I think it's going to, and we still have that sort of on the shelf. I think we're going to full circle here. I think we're going to do this thing where we kind of go out as a company, solve the cost transparency issues, and then start to come back and look at clinical efficacy. Because what you want, right, is I want to, get the most clinically effective drug at a cost and convenience to the patient, that they ultimately can afford. That's
Sure.
kind of what you're trying to sort out. And so I think we're in this we're figuring out the cost and convenience categories, right? What's sort of the right cost for you and what's convenient, for you in terms of time, driving from your home. Should we mail order it? If it's specialty, do we need to do a home infusion? Do we need to do it on site? Those are the cost and convenience things. And then starting to sort of say, what's the clinical efficacy here? What's the most clinically effective thing that we could prescribe? And there is kind of a subset in every condition of how you figure that out. But those are really, I think what we've learned is we're starting to get there enough with interoperability where you could have CDS tools that in real time could run both of these types of transactions, but we're still kind of early.
Yeah.
It's that challenge of sort of normalizing the clinical data in a fast enough turn for the doctor to get value out of those types of transactions, and two, doing the deciphering. A really good example is in type 2 diabetes. You've got, the clinical guideline for that, for just type 2 diabetes, about 157 pages. And I've tried to flip through it myself. I'm not a doctor, obviously. It's overwhelming at page 3. Because it's this big kind of clinical guidance or flow diagram of what you do depending on a whole host of factors with the patient, and comorbidities, existing medications, combination medications, their current A1C, right? All these things compound. And so I do think it's a full circle for us, but again, we've got to look at this as phases, and providing value along each one of those phases to get to that future state where clinical data is really evaluated alongside these transactions.
That makes sense. You mentioned this a little bit at the very beginning, but how did COVID impact your company?
Yeah, I mean, so what we saw very clearly was health systems did a full hard stop. Pretty much across the country. We have roughly 400 systems we're integrated with across the US. So we have a very broad reach in terms of seeing. The drop-off was pretty extreme. We saw, I don't know, about a third or half, depending on what market we were in, of clinical, prescribing just stopped.
Prescribing stopped. Actual prescribing. Okay. So
yeah, so
if patients weren't coming into the clinic, prescriptions weren't getting written.
Yep, exactly. And so we had that hard stop. Now we've seen pretty much that come back and start to grow well. I think what we're going to see, what we saw earlier this year where systems just shut down, and we had to be super respectful. I just would call up, potential prospects and say, well, how can, what do you need from me today? You need to cry on my shoulder. Yeah. You need PPE. What do you need? We did a bunch of fundraisers to help health systems during that time. We literally just shut down our sales. And it really became, how do we help our communities? How do we help our health systems get through this because they're in crisis mode? And we saw them, not only the stress on the employees and the nurses and the clinical staff, but we were getting phone calls from some of our larger health systems that were losing $50 to $100 million a month. That's the kind of thing that was happening for about 6 months. We've come out of that, and I think what we're going to see, I don't think we're going to see the same shutdowns going into next year. We're still going to see that distraction cost, though, to health systems in terms of having spikes in cases and having to deal with that, and then IT resources that are tied up in other things. We look at it as it's just denying the inevitability of it, right? Like, cost transparency will come to these systems, we'll get it to the doctors, we'll keep maturing that market. It just might take longer. Sure. And we might have, in some ways, I think it's interesting, we've lost 6 months to a year in terms of the maturity of that market. But I also think this really wonderful thing happened in that a lot of what we saw was really interesting. We saw the systems that were heavily embedded in elective procedures and fee-for-service hemorrhage cash. I mean, just hemorrhage money, right? Because all that stopped. And the systems that were more footed in value and had their own health plan, what happened, right, is the premiums went up and and nobody utilized any costs. And so their balance sheet was so much healthier, and they were much more resilient to COVID. And I think that just really did a wonderful thing to wake up a lot of systems to say, we got to stop this. We got to stop the insanity of this fee-for-service world. We've got to move into value. We've got to become more resilient. And the time is now. And so, and then you look at things like telehealth and the accelerate, nobody's ever going to use telehealth. Well, turns out everybody uses telehealth. And we've seen systems come back to a healthy, I'd say 25 to 30% utilization of telehealth. It's not going to go away. It's going to stay at much higher levels. And in a healthy state where if you're just doing a follow-up, and there's no reason to be there physically, like telehealth's the best. And I've done it twice this year myself, and I think it's fantastic. Yeah. So I think that's really what we're going to see as systems really have woken up in a healthy way to where they need to go and move into value, and start to shed some of these old models that aren't going to work in the future anymore.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've seen you give presentations about the company, and it's very clear that this is very personal to you. You've been at this for 6 or 7 years.
Almost 8.
Almost 8. It's a topic that, if people aren't in the know, could sound maybe a little dry, prescription price transparency, right? It's like, and yet it's very clear that to you, this is something much bigger and it's personal. So as kind of a closing question, why is that?
Yeah, so my story goes back to my childhood. I lost my dad to pancreatic cancer at 7, and my mom to colon cancer at 15. And I had to face, some really tough stuff as a kid. And I saw firsthand kind of the failing of the medical community and care at that time, right? Of how just terrible this can be. And I'll never forget, back in the, my mom carrying around all her paper records and just sort of all that stuff. And as I've gotten into technology, just seeing that need and understanding how many patients have gone through that suffering. And, we're seeing it so much this year with COVID and how many lives have been lost around it. So I've always had this sort of like fundamental need to want to be in this space in healthcare, and that personal story with my mother and father, it's just carried with me my whole life to sort of like, we got to make healthcare better in this country and make it more, more approachable I think the combination of technology will solve so many of these problems. Everything from, what we do today and bringing cost transparency to the market, but also really changing the way we deliver care and really curing people of a lot of these diseases. And so for me, it's just incredibly personal. And, I think it's a travesty that we live in a world, it's 2020 and we're still having this discussion. Shouldn't we just fix this stuff? Shouldn't we just make this happen and get on with our lives? And so we can get to the next stuff, the important stuff, the AI stuff, the informed autonomy and all the things that we should be really giving doctors from a technology perspective. And I think the last thing I'll say is just like, we live in a world where, medical minus COVID, right? Medical errors is the 3rd leading cause of death in this country. That is an absolute, and it's, pushing 20% of our GDP. And I have 2 boys. I can't imagine a world, I can't leave this world with them in the state it is today. And if it gets worse, that's not going to be an answer for me. Yeah. And so that's why I'm so dedicated, and I get up every day trying to solve this problem, and I'm incredibly committed to it.
And the stats around medical bankruptcy are just as staggering.
Just as staggering. It's we've got COVID issues, right, forcing a lot of people into bad financial situations, but it is right up there in terms of the leading cause of bankruptcy in this country, and that is a shame as well. We should be able to create a system that is highly efficient, driven by technology, where we can deliver care at an affordable price that delivers the outcomes we want. That isn't an impossibility, and the fact that we hold on to that idea needs to change.
Well, Carm, thanks for spending the time to share with me not just the update, but your passion as well. I thank you for spending the last 7 years on this or more, and appreciate that. I know you're gonna stay at it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too. Be well.
Yeah, bye.